A man pulls a drowning woman from a raging river, saving her life without knowing the cost. She's Apache. He's white. She was left to die by her own people, punishment for refusing a forced marriage. But when her tribe returns months later, they don't come for revenge. They come with sacred law. She belongs to him now, not as property, as destiny. What happens when two broken souls, separated by everything, but bound by one desperate act, must choose between tradition and the only freedom they've ever known? Stay until the end and comment your city, so I can see how far this story travels. The weight of silence. The canyon air held a peculiar stillness that afternoon, the kind that settles over New Mexico territory after a storm has wrung itself dry against the mountains. Thorne Maddox had learned to read such silences the way other men read newspapers carefully, with respect for what might be hidden in the quiet. He rode his gelding sergeant along the fence line that separated his modest cattle ranch from the raw wilderness beyond. The storm 3 days prior had been biblical in its fury, turning the ordinarily docile canyon river into a churning beast that had surely damaged his property. At 42, Thorne had stopped expecting anything in life to remain intact for long. The war had taught him that. His knee throbbed with each of Sergeant's steps, a permanent souvenir from Gettysburg that the frontier cold made worse. He'd been told by a Philadelphia doctor back when he still had money for such things that the leg would never fully heal. The doctor hadn't mentioned that neither would anything else about him. Thorne pulled his coat tighter. February 1876 was proving particularly unforgiving even for high desert country. He'd spent the morning checking the upper pastures and found exactly what he'd expected. 2 sections of fence down posts snapped like kindling wire, tangled in debris the river had thrown up in its rage. He'd have to rebuild. Again. The story of his life, really rebuilding what had been destroyed over and over until you couldn't remember what the original structure had even looked like. His late wife Margaret used to say he had a gift for starting over. She'd meant it kindly, but after she'd died of fever 4 years back, Thorne had come to understand it differently. Starting over wasn't a gift. It was a curse that followed men who couldn't hold on to what mattered. The canyon rim offered a straight view down to where the river bent east. From this height, the water looked deceptively peaceful, its surface reflecting the late afternoon sun in hammered silver. Thorne knew better. That river had killed men, horses, dreams. It had nearly killed him once years ago when he'd first arrived here and didn't yet understand the land's casual cruelty. Sergeant's ears suddenly pricked forward, swiveling toward the water. "Easy," Thorne murmured, trusting the horse's instincts more than his own. Cavalry training died hard. Then he heard it, or rather felt it. A wrongness in the air, a disturbance that didn't match the rhythm of wind and water. He urged Sergeant closer to the edge, squinting against the glare. That's when he saw the arm. It broke the water's surface like a pale flag of surrender, fingers splayed and grasping at nothing before disappearing beneath the current. For a heartbeat, Thorne thought he'd imagined it. The isolation did that, sometimes conjured phantoms out of desperation and too much whiskey. But then the arm appeared again, 20 yards downriver, thrashing now, and he knew it was real. Someone was drowning. Thorne didn't think. Thinking was what got men killed. He'd learned that at Antietam, at Chancellorsville, at a dozen other places whose names were carved into his memory like epitaphs. He kicked free of the stirrups and threw himself from the saddle, landing hard on his bad knee. Pain shot up his thigh, white-hot and blinding, but he was already running, half-stumbling down the rocky embankment toward the water. The figure surfaced again, definitely a person, definitely struggling. Dark hair plastered to a skull, one arm beating against the current that was dragging them toward the rapids downstream. Thorne hit the water at full stride. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath, locking his muscles. February runoff, fed by snowmelt from the Sangre de Cristo range, had no mercy in it. His boots filled immediately, dragging him down, but he pushed forward, using the rocks beneath to propel himself toward where he'd last seen the drowning figure. The current grabbed him indifferent to his intentions. For a moment, Thorn understood how easy it would be to just let go, to stop fighting the water, the pain, the relentless work of survival, to slip beneath the surface and finally rest. Then something solid bumped against him, a shoulder, a hip, and instinct took over. His fingers closed on fabric, deer skin slippery and heavy with water. He pulled, throwing his weight backward, his bad knee screaming protest as he planted his foot against a submerged boulder. The current fought him for the body, tried to rip it from his grasp. Thorn held on. He'd lost too much already. The war, his wife, his peace. He'd be damned if he'd lose this stranger too, with strength he didn't know he still possessed. Thorn hauled them both toward the shallows, dragging the limp figure through water that clawed and grasped like something alive and hungry. His lungs burned. His knee buckled twice, sending them both under, but he kept moving, kept pulling, kept refusing to surrender. Finally, impossibly, his boots found purchase on gravel. He dragged them both onto the bank, collapsing onto his back chest, heaving. The rescued person sprawled beside him like driftwood. For long moments, Thorn could do nothing but gasp at the sky and wonder if his heart would explode. The cold had invaded his bones, making his hands shake uncontrollably. Then he heard it, a wet, choking cough. The stranger was alive. Thorn rolled onto his side, ignoring the protest of every muscle, and for the first time got a clear look at who he'd pulled from the river. A woman, young, maybe 22. Apache, from the style of her dress and the way her hair had been braided before the water destroyed it. Her face was bruised along one cheek, and there were marks around her wrists. Rope burns still red and raw. She coughed again, water spilling from her lips. Her eyes squeezed shut against pain or fear or both. Thorn's cavalry training kicked back in. He'd seen wounded soldiers, knew the signs of shock and hypothermia. They needed shelter, fire, warmth, and they needed it now before the sun finished its descent and the desert cold turned lethal. His cabin was a quarter-mile back up the canyon, too far for him to carry her in his condition, but he'd managed impossible things before. "Can you hear me?" he asked, knowing she probably didn't speak English, but trying anyway. "I'm going to get you somewhere warm, just hold on." Her eyes opened, dark brown, almost black, filled with something between terror and resignation. She stared at him like he might be another threat, just dressed differently than the last one. Thorn understood that look. He'd seen it plenty during the war in the faces of people who'd been hurt too many times to trust rescue. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, holding her gaze. "I promise." Whether she understood his words or just his tone, something in her expression shifted. Not trust exactly, but maybe the beginning of a possibility that not all men were monsters. Thorn got to his knees, then his feet, his bad leg threatening to buckle with each movement. He bent down, sliding his arms beneath her, one under her shoulders, one under her knees, and lifted. She weighed almost nothing, or maybe adrenaline made her weightless. Either way, he had her. The climb back up the embankment nearly killed him. Twice his knee gave out, sending them both down to the dirt. Twice he forced himself back up, focusing on the next step, then the next, reducing the impossible to something manageable. Sargent waited where Thorn had left him, reins trailing, trained well enough not to run. Good horse, loyal even when loyalty was stupid. Getting into the saddle with a half-conscious woman in his arms proved impossible, so Thorn didn't try. He walked instead, leading Sargent with one hand supporting the woman, with his other arm moving like a three-legged dog toward home. The sun was setting by the time his cabin came into view, a modest structure of logs and stone smoke curling from the chimney where he'd left the fire banked that morning. It had never looked so beautiful. Thorn kicked the door open, bringing them both into the single large room that served as his kitchen living space and sometimes stable when the weather turned truly vicious. The fire had died to embers, but embers were enough. He laid her on the rug before the hearth, then immediately set to work building up the fire. His hands still shook from the cold, making the task harder than it should have been. But eventually flames caught and spread, filling the room with blessed warmth and orange light. The woman hadn't moved. Her lips were blue, her skin pale beneath its natural copper tone. Bad, very bad. Thorn grabbed every blanket he owned, 4 in total rough wool, that smelled of horse and wood smoke, and wrapped them around her, creating a cocoon against the cold. Then he stripped off his own soaked shirt and boots, hanging them near the fire to dry. Only then did he truly look at her injuries. The bruise on her face was dark, maybe a day old. The rope burns on her wrists were worse, crusted with dried blood, and her deerskin dress was torn in several places, revealing more bruises beneath rib, shoulder, thigh. Someone had hurt her, recently, methodically, and then someone had tied her up and left her by the river, to die. Rage kindled in Thorn's chest, hot and sudden. He'd seen this before, women used as currency, as punishment, as objects to be discarded when they no longer served a purpose. He'd seen it during the war in every town and territory he'd passed through since. He'd thought maybe the frontier was different, that survival left no room for such cruelty. He'd been wrong. The woman stirred, her eyes opening again. In the firelight he could see them more clearly, dark, yes, but with flecks of amber that caught the glow. Intelligent eyes, afraid but not broken. She said something in Apache, her voice rough from river water and screaming. "I don't understand," Thorn admitted, keeping his tone gentle. "But you're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." He moved slowly, showing his hands were empty, then reached for the canteen of water he kept by the hearth. He uncorked it and held it toward her. She watched him for a long moment, calculating. Then carefully she reached out from within her cocoon of blankets and took the canteen. She drank not the desperate gulping of someone dying of thirst, but measured sips, controlled. Even half frozen and beaten, she maintained dignity. Thorn found himself respecting that. "My name's Thorn," he said, touching his chest. "Thorn Maddox." She looked at him, processing, then repeated, "Torn." Close enough. She touched her own chest with one trembling hand. "Sana." The name hung in the air between them like an offering, an exchange, the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. "Sana," Thorn repeated, committing it to memory. "All right, Sana, you need to get warm. Those clothes, they're wet, and they're going to kill you if we don't get them off." He saw her eyes narrow with suspicion, and he couldn't blame her. What would she think, strange white man alone in a cabin telling her to remove her clothes? Thorn stood slowly, crossed to his trunk, and pulled out one of his shirts, clean, worn, soft from washing. He brought it back and laid it beside her, then deliberately walked to the far corner of the room and turned his back. "I'm not looking," he said. "Change into this, it's dry. I'll stay over here until you're done." He heard nothing for a long moment, then the rustle of wet leather, the whisper of fabric. When her voice finally came, torn, he turned around. She sat wrapped in his shirt, which hung on her like a tent. The blankets pulled back around her shoulders. Her wet dress lay in a heap beside her. She'd folded it, even soaked and torn as it was, maintaining order in chaos. Thorn hung the dress near the fire where his own clothes steamed and dripped. Then he brought her more water, some dried meat, a piece of hard bread. She ate slowly, watching him the entire time. Not hostile exactly, just vigilant, like an animal that hadn't decided whether to run or fight. Thorn made himself busy adding wood to the fire, checking the window shutters, anything to give her space without leaving her alone. His knee throbbed with each step, a reminder of limits he'd exceeded today. Night fell completely. The cabin became an island of warmth in an ocean of darkness and cold. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, reminding them both how fragile shelter really was. Thorn pulled his chair near the fire, not too close to her, but close enough that she could see his face in the firelight. He wasn't a young man anymore, and today's rescue had cost him. His hands still shook slightly, his breathing remained labored. "You should rest," he said, knowing she probably didn't understand the words, but hoping she'd catch the meaning. He mimed, sleeping, his hands pressed together beneath his tilted head. Sana watched him, then looked around the cabin, taking inventory of exits, weapons, dangers. Smart woman. When her gaze returned to him, something had shifted again. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the recognition that he'd had opportunities to hurt her and hadn't taken them. She lay down slowly, pulling the blankets tight around herself, and closed her eyes. But Thorn could tell from her breathing that she wasn't sleeping, just pretending, ready to bolt if he made a wrong move. So he stayed in his chair, feeding the fire, keeping watch. Not over her exactly, more like keeping guard, making sure nothing else could hurt her tonight. The hours passed, the fire crackled, the wind howled, and for the first time in the 4 years since Margaret had died, Thorn Maddox didn't feel entirely alone in his home. It wasn't comfort exactly, more like presence, the awareness that another life existed in the same space, breathing the same air, surviving the same darkness. Around midnight, he heard it, a sob, quickly stifled. He looked over to find Sana's shoulders shaking beneath the blankets, tears running silently down her face. Thorn stayed where he was. Some grief was too private to intrude upon, and he suspected hers ran deeper than any river, but he spoke into the darkness anyway, his voice low and steady. Whatever happened to you before today, that's done. You're alive. And while you're under this roof, nothing's going to hurt you. I give you my word. He didn't know if she understood, but she stopped crying, her breathing evening out, and finally, she slept for real. Thorn stayed awake through the night, keeping the fire burning, keeping the cold at bay. His knee ached, his back complained, his eyes burned with exhaustion, but he'd given his word, and words were all men like him had left. When dawn finally broke, painting the windows with pale gold light, Sana was still asleep. Her face had lost some of its pallor, her breathing deep and steady. Healing, maybe, or at least surviving. Thorn stood carefully, his joints protesting, and started making coffee. The familiar ritual, grinding beans, heating water, the bitter smell filling the cabin felt different somehow, less lonely, like performing for an audience of one. He was pouring his first cup when he heard her stir. He turned to find her sitting up, the blankets pooled around her waist, his shirt hanging off one shoulder. Her dark hair was a wild tangle around her face. She looked like something from a story, half-drowned maiden warrior, woman survivor. Their eyes met across the cabin. Thorn raised his coffee cup slightly, a small gesture that asked, "Are you all right?" Sana looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And sometimes Thorn thought as he poured a second cup of coffee, beginnings were all you could ask for. Outside, the canyon river ran on, indifferent to what it had almost destroyed and what it had accidentally brought together. Inside, two strangers sat in silence, drinking bitter coffee, trying to figure out what came next. Neither knew that by pulling her from that water, Thorn had set something in motion that neither of them could stop. That sacred laws, older than any government, were already reshaping their futures, binding them together in ways that transcended choice. But that knowledge would come soon enough. For now, they had this warmth, coffee survival. For now, that was enough. The second morning brought snow. Thorn woke in his chair, neck stiff and protesting, to find white flakes drifting past the window like ash from some distant fire. He dozed off sometime after dawn, the exhaustion finally claiming what willpower couldn't hold back. The fire had burned down to coals again, and the cabin held that particular chill that meant winter wasn't finished with them yet. Sana was awake, sitting upright near the hearth, with the blankets wrapped around her like armor. She watched him with those dark, calculating eyes, and Thorn had the distinct impression she'd been watching him sleep for some time. Cataloging his weaknesses, maybe. Planning her escape route. He couldn't fault her for that. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. He stood slowly, his knee immediately reminding him of yesterday's heroics, with a sharp lance of pain that made him suck air through his teeth. Sana's gaze dropped to his leg, then back to his face. She said something in Apache, a question from her tone. Thorn shrugged, moving toward the fire to build it back up. "Old war wound," Acts up when I do stupid things like diving into rivers. He fed kindling to the coals, blowing gently until flames caught. Which I suppose means it acts up fairly regular. She didn't understand the words, but something in his self-deprecating tone must have translated. The corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough to matter. The day established a rhythm born of necessity. Thorn made coffee and cornmeal mush, which they ate in silence while snow continued to fall outside. He tried not to stare, but he found himself watching her anyway, the careful way she ate, testing each bite first, as if expecting poison. The way her eyes tracked every movement he made, never quite relaxing. After breakfast, she surprised him. While he was pulling on his boots to go check on Sergeant in the small lean-to stable, Sana stood still, wrapped in his shirt and blankets, and began gathering up the tin plates and cups they'd used. "You don't have to," Thorn started, but she was already moving to the basin, pouring water from the kettle to wash the dishes. He watched her work, methodical and efficient, despite the oversized shirt slipping off her shoulder, despite the bruises that must still ache. She wasn't asking for permission, she was simply refusing to be helpless. Thorn recognized that impulse. It was the same one that had driven him to build this cabin with his own hands after Margaret died, to work until his body screamed for rest, because rest meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. "Thank you," he said quietly. She glanced at him, then nodded once. An acknowledgement, an exchange of respect between survivors who understood that usefulness was sometimes the only dignity left to claim. The days that followed fell into a pattern neither had agreed to, but both seemed to need. Thorn would wake early, build up the fire, make coffee. Sana would wake shortly after, and without discussion, they'd divide the labor of living. She took over the cooking and cleaning with a fierce efficiency that spoke of muscle memory, a woman who'd run a household before, who knew her way around a hearth and a knife. He handled the outside work, caring for Sergeant, checking the property hunting when the weather cleared enough. His knee complained about all of it, but pain was an old companion by now. They spoke little at first. The language barrier made conversation nearly impossible, and both seemed comfortable with silence anyway. But slowly, carefully, they began building a vocabulary between them. Thorn would point to objects, fire, water, horse, snow, and say the English word. Sana would repeat it in her accented voice, then offer the Apache equivalent. He tried to repeat her words, mangling most of them badly enough that she'd actually laugh, a brief startled sound that seemed to surprise her as much as him. "What's the Apache word for stubborn?" he asked one afternoon, watching her try to mend a tear in his spare shirt with thread she'd carefully pulled from her own damaged dress. She looked up, not understanding the question, but catching his teasing tone. He pointed at her, then crossed his arms and set his jaw in an exaggerated expression of determination. Sana's eyes narrowed, but he caught the hint of amusement there. She pointed back at him and repeated the gesture, raising an eyebrow. "Fair point," Thorn conceded. "Takes one to know one." But the real communication happened in the spaces between words, in the way she'd set his coffee cup beside his chair each morning without being asked, in the way he'd avert his eyes when she needed privacy, turning his back or stepping outside even when the cold bit through his shirt, in the way she'd started leaving the door to the small sleeping alcove open at night, not an invitation but a declaration that she no longer feared he'd hurt her. Trust Thorn had learned wasn't given. It was earned in increments so small they were almost invisible until you looked back and realized how far you'd come. On the fourth night, Sana spoke more than she ever had before. They were sitting near the fire after supper, venison stew she'd made with dried vegetables from his meager stores, somehow turning his bachelor provisions into something that actually tasted like a meal. Thorn was working on replacing a broken leather strap on his saddle, and Sana was weaving something from thin strips she'd cut from the hem of her dress. "Why?" she asked suddenly in English. Thorn looked up. "Why what?" She gestured at the space between them, at the cabin, at everything. Her English was limited, but her meaning was clear. Why had he saved her? Why was he letting her stay? Why wasn't he demanding payment of some kind? Thorne set down the saddle strap, thinking about how to answer in words she'd understand. "You would have died," he said, finally, keeping his words simple and direct. "I couldn't let that happen." "Why?" she asked again, more insistent. He met her eyes across the firelight. "Because it would have been wrong." She studied him for a long moment, and he could see her mind working, trying to reconcile him with whatever men she'd known before. Finally, she spoke again, slower, choosing words carefully. "Your woman." She gestured around the cabin, noting the absence of feminine presence. "Dead," Thorne said quietly. 4 years ago. Fever." "Sad," Sana said, and the simple word carried genuine empathy. "Yeah," Thorne agreed. It was. They sat in silence for a while after that, but it felt different, less guarded. More like two people sharing space, rather than two strangers occupying opposite corners. Later, as Thorne was banking the fire for the night, Sana spoke again. "Sana, no good." She struggled with the English frustration clear on her face. She touched her chest, then made a gesture of pushing away. "Apache say, no good, bad." Thorne straightened, understanding flooding through him. "They told you that you were bad. That's why they—" He gestured toward the river, toward what had been done to her. She nodded, her jaw tight. "They're wrong," Thorne said firmly. "You're not bad, whatever they think you did." "No, Mary," Sana interrupted. She made a gesture with her hands. Two people joining, then her pushing one away. "Old man, I say no. Apache angry. Say I... She struggled to find the word, finally settling on shame. The picture came together. She'd refused an arranged marriage, probably to some elder or important man in the tribe. In a culture where such refusals could be seen as disrespect to the entire community, she'd been punished, cast out, left to die as a warning to other young women who might dare to choose their own path. "You did nothing wrong," Thorne said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "A woman has a right to say no, to any man, for any reason." Sana looked at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language, which, in a way, he had. The idea that a woman's refusal could be valid, respected, honored. It was clearly a concept she'd never encountered before. "You think?" she asked tentatively. "I know," Thorne replied. "My wife Margaret, she chose me. I asked, and she could have said no. That's how it should be. Choice. Both people choosing." Something shifted in Sana's expression then, not gratitude exactly, more like recognition. The realization that maybe the world was bigger than she'd been taught, that maybe there were men who saw women as more than property or prizes. She nodded, slowly processing this information, then retreated to her sleeping alcove. But Thorne noticed that night that she didn't close the door at all anymore. The snow continued off and on for the next week, trapping them inside the cabin for long stretches. Thorne worried about his small herd of cattle, but there was nothing to be done. The animals would either survive or they wouldn't. Nature didn't negotiate. The forced proximity pushed them into a domestic routine that felt oddly natural. Sana proved to be remarkably capable. She could stretch provisions Thorne would have burned through in days, knew how to make poultices from dried herbs for his aching knee, and had a gift for finding small ways to improve the cabin's comfort. She'd fashioned a better poker for the fire from a broken tool handle. She'd reorganized his pantry in a way that actually made sense. She'd even managed to repair the broken latch on the window shutter that he'd been meaning to fix for months. In return, Thorne made sure she had everything she needed. He fashioned her a better dress from a spare wool blanket, cutting and sewing with the clumsy skill of a man who'd done his own mending for years. It wasn't beautiful, but it was warm and whole, and when he presented it to her, she'd touched the fabric with a reverence that suggested she hadn't received many gifts in her life. "Thank you," she'd said in careful English. and he'd nodded, embarrassed by her gratitude for something so basic. They taught each other more words. She learned bread, snow, tired morning, careful, sorry. He learned fire, water, food, thank you, and though he wouldn't realize the significance until much later, words that roughly translated to safe, chosen, and belonging. One afternoon, when the snow had paused and pale sunlight streamed through the windows, Sana did something unexpected. She began to sing. It was a quiet song, more hum than words, in a minor key that spoke of loss and endurance. She sang while grinding corn, her hands moving in rhythm with the melody, and Thorn found himself stopping his work just to listen. When she finished, the silence felt heavier than before. "That was beautiful," he said. She looked up surprised, as if she'd forgotten he was there. Then she offered him a small, sad smile. "Mother's song," she explained, touching her heart. "Dead now." "I'm sorry," Thorn said, meaning it. "Many dead," Sana replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd accumulated too many losses to mourn them individually. "Mother, father, brother, sister, all gone." Thorn understood then that they were more alike than different. Both orphaned by life, both carrying ghosts, both surviving because stopping would dishonor those who couldn't. "I had a brother," he offered, "died at Vicksburg, and my parents, fever took them when I was young." "Sad," Sana said again and again. The simple word carried weight. "Yeah," Thorn agreed, "but we're still here." "Still here," she repeated, testing the phrase, finding its truth. The next morning, Thorn woke to find her braiding her hair in the Apache style, using a broken piece of mirror propped on the window ledge. Her bruises had faded to yellow-green, and the rope burns on her wrists were healing clean. She'd regained weight too, the hollow look around her eyes, filling in her movements less fragile. She was healing, reclaiming herself. When she caught him watching, she didn't look away. Instead, she held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a question neither was ready to voice. Thorn broke the moment first, standing abruptly. "I need to check the fence line. Storm might have brought more damage." "I come," Sana said immediately. "It's cold out there," Thorn warned. "And the snow, I come," she repeated more firmly. Not asking, stating. Thorn recognized that tone. He'd used it himself plenty of times, the sound of someone who was done being protected and needed to reclaim their agency, even if it meant being uncomfortable. "All right," he agreed. "Bundle up." They walked the property together that afternoon, Thorn showing her the boundaries of his land, the state of his small herd, the repairs needed. Sana asked questions with her limited English and expansive gestures, and he found himself explaining not just what things were, but why he'd built them that way, what he hoped to accomplish. She listened with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing everything, building a map of this new world she'd found herself in. At one point, they stood on the canyon rim, looking down at the river that had nearly killed her. The water ran swift and cold, indifferent to its own violence. "You, not afraid?" Sana asked, nodding toward the water. "Of the river always," Thorn admitted. "Fear keeps you careful, but you can't let it keep you from living near water just because it's dangerous." Sana considered this, then said something in Apache, a longer phrase that sounded like a proverb or teaching. "What's that mean?" Thorn asked. She struggled for the English, finally settling on "fire burns, water drowns, still need fire, need water, need dangerous things." "That's wise," Thorn said. "Mother say," Sana replied, a flicker of old grief crossing her face. They stood there together, two survivors, looking at the thing that had tried to destroy one of them, and Thorn felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction exactly, or not only that, more like kinship, the recognition of a fellow traveler on a hard road. When they returned to the cabin, Sana made dinner while Thorn tended to the evening chores, and the domesticity of it all struck him suddenly. This was starting to feel less like a temporary situation and more like something else, something he wasn't ready to name. That night, after they'd eaten and cleaned up, Sana brought her weaving project to the fire. She'd been working on it for days, and Thorn could now see it was taking the shape of a belt or sash, the pattern intricate and beautiful. "What are you making?" he asked. She held it up, studying her work critically. "For you," she said simply. Thorn felt something catch in his throat. "You don't have to want to," Sana interrupted, meeting his eyes. "You give dress, I give this. An exchange, not obligation, but choice. The kind of gift that meant something because it didn't have to be given." "Thank you," Thorn said the words, feeling inadequate. Sana nodded, returning to her weaving, and the cabin settled into comfortable silence, broken only by the pop of the fire and the whisper of thread through fingers that had known harder work than this. Outside, the wind picked up again and fresh snow began to fall. But inside, two people sat warm and safe, building something neither could name from the materials. At hand, respect, gratitude, shared silence, and the tentative hope that maybe they didn't have to face the cold alone. Thorn didn't know it yet, but he was already falling. Not the sudden plummet of lust or the dramatic sweep of romance, but the slow, steady descent of a man learning to trust again, learning that maybe survival wasn't enough, that maybe, just maybe, there was still room in his scarred heart for something more. And Sana, for her part, was beginning to understand that not all prisons had walls, that she'd been trapped by expectations and traditions and the judgment of others her whole life, and that here in this rough cabin with this scarred man who asked nothing of her but honesty, she was tasting freedom for the first time. Neither spoke of these realizations. Some truths were too fragile to voice aloud. But as the night deepened and the fire burned down to embers, they both felt it, the subtle shift from temporary shelter to something more permanent, from stranger to companion, from rescue to choice. The river had tried to take her life. Instead, it had delivered her to this threshold, this moment, this possibility, and for the first time since she'd refused that arranged marriage and sealed her fate, Sana felt something she'd thought was lost forever. She felt hope. The transformation happened so gradually that Thorn didn't notice it until one morning in early March, when he woke to the smell of coffee already brewing and realized he'd slept through Sana's morning routine entirely. She moved through his cabin now with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged there, and somewhere along the way he'd stopped flinching every time she reached for something or moved too quickly. She'd stopped flinching around him too. The winter had been long, but spring was finally asserting itself. The snow had retreated to the highest peaks, and the canyon was coming alive again with color. Hardy wildflowers pushing through thawed ground, cottonwoods budding along the river, birds returning from wherever they'd hidden during the cold months. Thorn found himself noticing these things more acutely with Sana beside him. She had a way of stopping to observe small miracles. He would have walked past a lizard sunning itself on a rock, the precise geometry of ice crystals melting on a window, the way morning light caught in her hair when she stood in the doorway watching the sunrise. That last observation was becoming a problem. He was aware of her now in ways that had nothing to do with obligation or protection. The curve of her neck when she bent over her sewing, the sound of her humming those Apache songs while she worked, the rare, brilliant smile she offered when something genuinely pleased her, a smile that felt like a gift every time because she didn't give it easily. Thorn told himself it was natural. They'd been living in close quarters for over a month. Proximity bred familiarity. It didn't mean anything more than that, but he was lying to himself, and he knew it. The truth announced itself one afternoon when they were working together to repair the chicken coop he'd been neglecting. Sana handed him a nail, their fingers brushed, and Thorn felt that contact like a brand. He pulled back too quickly, nearly dropping the hammer, and when he looked up, he found her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Sorry," he muttered, taking the nail more carefully. Why sorry? Sana asked, tilting her head. Her English had improved dramatically, though she still spoke in simple, direct phrases that somehow cut through to the heart of things. Thorn started, then stopped. How could he explain that he was afraid of wanting something he had no right to want? That every day she stayed made it harder to remember she was here by circumstance, not choice. That he was terrified of becoming just another man who believed he was owed something by a woman under his roof. Nothing, he finished lamely. Hand me another nail. But Sana didn't move. She stood there holding the box of nails, studying him with those dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. You are strange man, Torn, she said finally. How so? You save Sana. You give food, give home, give safe. She struggled for the words, her frustration visible. Other men, they want, they take. You. She made a gesture of holding something carefully, protectively. You give only, never take. That's how it should be, Thorn said quietly. No, Sana countered, shaking her head. That is how should be, but is not. You are different. She said the word like she was still trying to decide if different was good or dangerous. Thorn went back to hammering, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but Sana wasn't finished. You want? She asked softly. The hammer slipped, smashing his thumb. Thorn cursed, dropping the tool and shaking his hand. Sana was beside him instantly, taking his injured hand in both of hers, examining the damage with a healer's practiced eye. Her touch was gentle, clinical, and absolutely devastating. Not bad, she pronounced, but she didn't let go of his hand. Instead, she stood there holding it, looking up at him, with a question in her eyes that made his heart hammer harder than any nail he'd ever driven. Sana, Thorn said, his voice rough. He pulled his hand back carefully, putting distance between them. I think I'm going to check the north fence. Might be gone a while. He walked away before she could respond, before he could do something stupid like answer her question honestly. The north fence didn't need checking, but Thorn spent 2 hours inspecting it anyway, giving himself time to think. The problem was that thinking only clarified what he'd been trying to ignore. He was falling in love with a woman who'd been through hell, who'd been abandoned by her people and nearly killed for the crime of choosing her own path. The last thing she needed was another man projecting his needs onto her, even if those needs were wrapping themselves around his heart like bindweed, impossible to extract without tearing something vital. When he returned to the cabin as the sun was setting, he found Sana sitting on the porch step wrapped in a shawl she'd made from scraps. She'd been waiting for him. I make supper, she said. Is getting cold. Sorry, Thorn said. Lost track of time. They ate in awkward silence, the easy companionship of the past weeks, fractured by the conversation that had gone unfinished. Thorn could feel Sana watching him, weighing something, making decisions he wasn't privy to. Finally, after they'd cleaned up and the cabin had settled into evening quiet, Sana spoke. Torn, she said, and something in her tone made him look up from the harness he was mending. I ask question before, you not answer. I know, Thorn said quietly. Why? He set down the leather, meeting her eyes across the firelight. Because I didn't want to make you uncomfortable. You're here because you had nowhere else to go, not because... He stopped, struggling for the right words. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything, like you have to be something you're not just because I gave you shelter. Sana listened, processing this, then said something in Apache that sounded frustrated. She switched back to English, speaking slowly to make sure he understood. Apache men, they say woman is for work, for babies, for... She made a gesture that suggested property. They say woman not choose, woman not say no. Her eyes hardened. I say no. Apache leave Sana to die. I know, Thorn said softly, and you were right to say no. You should always have the right to say no. Yes, Sana agreed. Woman say no, but also... She took a breath, gathering courage. Woman say yes when woman want, when woman choose. The words hung in the air between them like smoke visible and untouchable. Thorn's mouth went dry. Sana, you don't have to. I know, she interrupted. You say many times. I not have to, but what if Sana want to? She stood moving closer, and Thorn found himself rooted to his chair, unable to move or breathe or think. What if Sana choose? Choose what? Thorn managed, though he knew exactly what she was asking. Sana stood before him now, close enough that he could see the pulse beating in her throat, the slight tremor in her hands that said she was as nervous as he was. You, she said simply, choose you. Thorn's heart was doing something complicated and painful in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to stand, to close that final distance, to take what was being offered. But 4 years of grief and a lifetime of trying to be better than the worst men he'd known kept him frozen. Why? He asked hoarsely. Sana considered the question seriously. You save Sana life. You give home. You give respect. You... She struggled for the concept finally settling on. You see Sana. Not woman. Not Apache. Not thing. You see Sana. She touched her chest over her heart. Here. I do see you, Thorn admitted. Every day. You're remarkable, Sana. Strong and capable and... He stopped himself before he said too much. But that doesn't mean you owe me anything. Choice means you can say no. It also means you can say nothing. You don't have to choose at all. Yes, Sana agreed. Can say no, can say nothing, or... She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and placed her hand against his cheek. Her palm was warm, calloused from work, gentle as snowfall. Can say yes. Thorn closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, despite himself. Are you sure? He whispered, timid. Sana, I need you to be sure, because if this... He opened his eyes, looking at her with naked vulnerability. I'm not a young man. I'm damaged. I've got a bad knee and bad dreams, and I'm too stubborn for my own good. You deserve better than... Sana pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. Torn, she said, and there was something almost amused in her tone. You save Sana from river, from cold, from alone. She moved her hand from his mouth to his chest, over his heart, mirroring where she'd touched her own. You good man, strange, yes, stubborn, yes, but good. You're sure? Thorn asked again, needing to hear it one more time. Sure, Sana confirmed. Then carefully enunciating each word, Sana choose torn. Something in Thorn's chest that had been locked tight since Margaret died finally carefully began to open. He stood slowly, mindful of his knee, and for a moment they simply stood there facing each other in the firelight. Then, with a gentleness that bordered on reverence, Thorn lifted his hand and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone where the bruise had finally faded completely. I choose you too, he said quietly, if you'll have me. Sana's answer was to step closer, closing the distance between them until they were breathing the same air. She was small against his frame, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder, but she didn't feel fragile. She felt solid, real, present. When she tilted her face up, Thorn understood the invitation. He bent slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, and when their lips finally met, it was with a tenderness that bordered on painful. The kiss was chaste, careful, more question than answer. But when they pulled apart, something fundamental had shifted between them. The air felt different, charged with possibility. We should... Thorn started, then stopped, unsure how to proceed. The rules of courtship didn't seem to apply here in this cabin at the edge of wilderness between two people who'd already been living as something more than strangers, but less than lovers. Sana solved the problem by taking his hand and leading him toward the sleeping alcove. Not pulling, not demanding, just guiding the way she might guide him through a darkness he couldn't navigate alone. At the threshold, Thorn stopped. Sana, he said, his voice strained, I need you to know, if we do this, it means something to me. It's not just, I'm not just looking for—" "I know," Sana interrupted gently. She touched his face again, that gesture of comfort and connection. "Mean something to Sana too. Mean choose, mean stay. Stay." Thorn repeated the word, carrying weight he didn't fully understand yet. "You want to stay, even after winter's over, after you could leave." "Where Sana go?" she asked simply. "Apache say Sana dead. Sana say Apache dead. Here." She gestured around the cabin at the life they'd built together over the past weeks. "Here is home now." It was the most she'd ever said at once in English, and the effort showed in her careful pronunciation, her precise word choice. But the meaning was clear. Thorn felt something break open inside him, some final wall he'd built. After Margaret died, the one that said he wasn't allowed to want this, wasn't allowed to hope for anything beyond survival. "Then stay," he said, "for as long as you want, forever if that's what you choose." Sana smiled, then one of those rare, brilliant smiles that transformed her entire face. "Forever is long time," she said, a hint of teasing in her voice. "Maybe start with tonight." Despite everything, the tension, the fear, the weight of the moment, Thorn laughed. "Yeah," he agreed, "we can start with tonight." What happened next was slow, careful, and utterly devoid of the violence that had marked so much of both their lives. Thorn took his time, letting Sana set the pace, making sure every touch was welcome, every progression was chosen. There was nervousness on both sides, the awkwardness of new intimacy, the vulnerability of being seen, but there was also tenderness, respect, and something deeper that neither could name but both could feel. When they finally came together, it wasn't with the desperate passion of romance stories, but with something quieter and more profound. It was two people who'd survived impossible things, choosing to survive together, choosing to be more than alone, choosing to believe that maybe despite everything they'd lost, there was still room in the world for this, for connection, for comfort, for a gentleness neither had expected to find. Afterward, they lay tangled in blankets, Sana's head on Thorn's chest, his hand stroking her hair with absent reverence. The fire had burned down to embers, painting the room in shades of amber and shadow. "You okay?" Thorn asked quietly. "Okay," Sana confirmed. Then after a pause, "Torn, yeah, what we do now?" It was such a practical question, so perfectly Sana, that Thorn smiled in the darkness. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess we wake up tomorrow and keep living, keep building, see what comes." "That good plan," Sana said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. They fell asleep like that, holding each other against the night, and for the first time since they'd met, neither one startled awake with nightmares. The ghosts that usually haunted them seemed to have retreated, giving them this one night of peace. Morning came gently. Thorn woke to find Sana already awake, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was no regret there, no fear, just a kind of wondering, as if she couldn't quite believe this was real. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," she echoed, then, "Torn, not sorry." "No," Thorn said immediately. "Oh, are you?" Sana shook her head. "No, sorry." She touched his face, that gesture that was becoming familiar, becoming theirs. "Happy." The word was simple, but hearing it from her lips, this woman who'd been left to die, who'd survived against impossible odds, who'd chosen to trust him with her body and her future, felt like an absolution Thorn hadn't known he needed. "Me too," he said. "I'm happy too." They rose, eventually returning to the rhythms of daily life, but finding them transformed. Everything felt different now, the way they moved around each other in the cabin's small space, the casual touches that had been forbidden before, the looks that lingered longer than necessary. They were still the same people, but they were also something new, something neither had expected to become. As Thorn went about his morning chores, feeding Sargent and checking the property, he found himself smiling for no reason. Found himself thinking about Sana, waiting in the cabin, about returning to her, about the life they were building, one ordinary day at a time. He didn't hear the riders approaching until Sergeant's ears pricked forward the horse's head, swinging toward the tree line. Thorn looked up to see 6 Apache warriors emerging from the forest mounted on painted horses, moving with the quiet certainty of men who knew exactly where they were going and why. His blood turned to ice. They'd come for her. Finally, inevitably, they'd come to finish what they'd started, to make sure the woman who defied their laws stayed dead. Thorn's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle he'd left leaning against the cabin wall, but he was too far away to reach it before the riders closed the distance. His mind raced, calculating odds, planning defense, preparing to fight, even though he knew he couldn't win. But he'd be damned if he'd let them take Sana without a fight. He'd die first, gladly. The riders stopped at the edge of his property, their horses stamping and blowing steam in the cool morning air. The lead rider was an older man, his face weathered like canyon stone, his eyes sharp and measuring. He raised one hand in a gesture that Thorn's cavalry training recognized as peaceful intent. That didn't mean Thorn trusted it. The old man spoke in Apache, his voice carrying across the distance, and Thorn heard the cabin door open behind him. Sana emerged, her face pale but set with determination. She walked to stand beside Thorn, close enough that their shoulders touched. The old man spoke again, longer this time, and Sana responded in Apache. The exchange continued for several minutes, while Thorn stood there uselessly, unable to understand a word, his heart hammering against his ribs. Finally, Sana turned to him. "They know," she said quietly. "They know Sana alive. They come to—" She struggled for the English word, then settled on "to talk." "Talk about what?" Thorn asked, his voice tight. Sana took a breath. "About sacred law." The words hung in the air like smoke from a rifle shot, and Thorn felt his entire body tense. Sacred law. He didn't know what that meant in Apache culture, but he knew enough about tribal customs to understand that laws, especially sacred ones, weren't suggestions. They were absolute, binding, enforced with a severity that made frontier justice look gentle by comparison. "What's sacred law?" Thorn asked, keeping his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his throat. His hand had drifted to his hip where his revolver would have been if he'd been wearing it. Stupid. He'd gotten too comfortable, too domestic. A man didn't greet armed riders without being armed himself. The old Apache dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He was making himself vulnerable, Thorn realized, showing peaceful intent. The other 5 riders remained mounted, hands visible and empty of weapons, though Thorn had no doubt they could change that in a heartbeat if needed. Sana spoke rapidly in Apache to the elder, her tone respectful but firm. The old man listened, nodded, then responded in a voice that carried the weight of authority earned over decades. "He is Nalnish." Sana translated, her English faltering slightly under stress. "He is the wise one, the one who speaks for spirits and ancestors." She paused, searching for words. "He say, when man save Apache life, that life belongs to the man who saves. Sacred law, very old law." Thorn's stomach dropped. "Belongs, what do you mean, belongs?" Sana turned to face him fully, and he could see the conflict in her eyes, fear, resignation, something else he couldn't identify. "Mean, you save Sana from death. By sacred law, Sana life is yours now, your responsibility, your—" She struggled with the concept, finally settling on a word that made Thorn's blood run cold. "Property." "No," Thorn said, immediately, his voice sharp. "Absolutely not. I don't own you. I don't own anyone." The elder spoke again, his tone patient, and Sana translated haltingly. "Nalnish say, not own like horse or blanket, own like responsibility, like—" She touched her chest, then reached out to touch his. "Like when 2 people marry, man responsible for woman, woman responsible for man, sacred bond." Thorn shook his head, trying to process what he was hearing. "So because I pulled you out of the river, they think we're—" "What married? Not married, Sana corrected, still translating the elder's measured words, but connected. Sacred law say you save life, you responsible for that life. Must protect, must provide, must... She frowned, listening carefully to Nalnish's next phrase. Must make family, or... Her voice dropped. Or Sana must die. Cannot live with no family. Sacred law. The casual brutality of it hit Thorn like a fist. Either accept responsibility for her, become her family, her protector, essentially her husband, in all but name, or they would kill her. Complete what they'd started at the river, because in their worldview, a woman without family, without a man to be responsible for her, was already dead. The walking dead were an affront to the natural order, to the sacred balance. That's barbaric, Thorn said, his jaw tight with anger. Sana's hand touched his arm, a gentle warning. Is law, she said simply. Old law, Apache follow, always follow. Nalnish spoke again, longer this time, and Thorn watched Sana's expression shift as she listened. When she translated, her voice was softer, more thoughtful. He say, Sana was punished for breaking engagement, for refusing marriage to Delshe, important man in tribe. Sana brought shame. Apache law say she must die. She paused, her throat working as she swallowed hard. But sacred law is older than Apache law. Sacred law say when man saves life, that life belongs to Savior. This law is from the ancestors, from the spirits. Cannot break sacred law without cursing entire tribe. So they're saying that because I saved you, their law requiring your death is what overruled. Thorn was trying to follow the logic, trying to understand the cultural framework he'd stumbled into. Yes, Sana said, sacred law is bigger, more important, but sacred law has requirement too, must accept responsibility, must accept bond, must... She met his eyes, and he saw fear there, but also something else. Hope, maybe, or the fragile beginning of it. Must want to keep Sana alive, must choose to protect. The elder spoke again, and this time there was a question in his tone. Sana translated without looking away from Thorn's face. Nalnish asked, do you accept sacred bond? Do you accept responsibility for Sana life? Do you... She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Do you want Sana as yours to protect, to provide for, to make family with? Thorn's mind was racing. This was insane. He'd pulled a drowning woman from a river, done the decent thing, and now he was being told he had to, marry her, claim her, or watch them kill her, because some ancient law said women couldn't exist outside the framework of male protection. Everything in him rebelled against the concept, against the idea that Sana was anyone's property, including his, against the brutal logic that said her only value was in belonging to someone. But even as he thought it, another part of his mind, the practical part that had kept him alive through war and wilderness, was calculating. They would kill her if he said no. These weren't idle threats. They'd already left her to die once. They'd come back now only because sacred law demanded it, because refusing to acknowledge that law would curse their entire tribe. But if he refused the bond, if he rejected the responsibility, their obligation ended. And so would Sana's life. And there was something else, something that made his chest tight and his heart pound, something he'd been trying not to admit to himself. He wanted her to stay, not as property, not as obligation, but as the woman who'd somehow slipped past his defenses and made him remember what it felt like to not be alone. The woman who hummed while she worked and braided her hair in the morning light and looked at him like he was worth something more than his scars and failures. Last night had changed things, or maybe it had just revealed what was already there. Thorn took a breath, meeting Nalnish's patient, measuring gaze. The old man was waiting, but not with impatience. This was clearly a decision that required thought, respect, the proper weight of consideration. Sana, Thorn said carefully, not taking his eyes off the elder. What do you want? Not what they want. Not what the law says. What do you want? He felt her hand tighten on his arm. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tremor he could feel in her fingers. "Sana, want to live," she said simply. "Want to choose life, want to—" She paused, then continued in a voice so quiet he almost missed it. "Want to stay with Torn, want to build garden, make home, be—" She struggled for the English word, finally settling on "be free," even if freedom means sacred bond. There was a paradox in that statement that would have been funny if the stakes weren't so deadly serious. Freedom through bondage, choice through obligation, life through surrender. But Thorn understood what she meant. If the only way she could live was by accepting this sacred law, by being bound to him in the eyes of her people, then that was still more freedom than dying had offered. Still more choice than drowning in that river. The bondage was to the law, not to him. With him, she'd already discovered something different. Something that looked like mutual respect, shared labor, chosen intimacy. Maybe that was all the freedom anyone could really hope for in this world. The freedom to choose which obligations to accept, which responsibilities to shoulder, which laws to live by. Thorn turned back to Nalnish, straightening his spine despite his bad knee's protest, and spoke clearly. "I accept," he said. "I accept responsibility for Sana's life. I accept the sacred bond. I will protect her, provide for her, and make family with her." He paused, making sure Sana was translating accurately, then added, "But I want one thing understood. In my house, Sana is not property. In my house, she chooses. She has voice. She has power. That's the only way I'll accept this bond." Sana translated rapidly, and Thorn watched Nalnish's weathered face for reaction. The old man listened, considered, then responded with what might have been the hint of approval in his dark eyes. "Nalnish say," Sana translated, and there was something like relief in her voice. "Sacred law not make slave. Sacred law make family, make protection. How you and Sana live together, that is between you and Sana and the spirits who watch over you. Nalnish only care that sacred law is honored. That responsibility is accepted." She paused, listening to the elder continue. "He say, you are strange man, white man who understands sacred law better than some Apache men. This is good. This means Sana will be protected with honor, not just with duty." Nalnish stepped forward, then closing the distance between himself and Thorn until they stood face to face. The old man was shorter, bent slightly with age, but his presence was formidable. He placed one weathered hand on Thorn's shoulder, and Thorn had the presence of mind to return the gesture, his hand finding the elder's shoulder in what he hoped was the appropriate response. Nalnish spoke, his voice carrying a weight of ritual, of words that had been spoken countless times over countless generations. Sana translated her voice, taking on a formal quality. "By sacred law, ancient as the mountains, deep as the rivers, eternal as the stars, I name you husband who saved life. I name you protector who chose responsibility. The woman Sana who was dead to us is now living in you. Her life is your life. Your honor is her honor. What harms her harms you. What honors her honors you. The bond is made." Nalnish removed his hand from Thorn's shoulder and turned to Sana, speaking directly to her now in Apache. Sana's response was quieter, more personal, but Thorn could hear the emotion threading through her words. When she translated for him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I accept the bond. I accept the life that was saved. I accept the responsibility to honor the one who saved me, to build family, to choose life over death, freedom over shame." She took a shaking breath. "I accept Torn as my husband by sacred law." It was done, simple as that. No ceremony beyond words and gesture. No witnesses beyond 5 silent Apache warriors who'd watched the entire exchange with the impassive patience of men who'd seen such rituals countless times. No celebration, no feast, no marking of the occasion beyond the acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted in the fabric of the world. Nalnish stepped back, inclining his head slightly to Thorn, then to Sana. He spoke again, and Sana translated with obvious relief. He say, "We are married now. By sacred law, Sana is Torn's wife. Torn is Sana's husband. Apache will not come here again to harm Sana. Apache will not speak Sana's name with the living or the dead. Sana is—" She paused, searching for the right translation. Sana is outside Apache now, neither dead nor living to them, only living to husband. This is the way of sacred law. It was a strange kind of freedom, Thorn thought, to be declared neither dead nor living to your own people, to exist only in relation to the man who'd pulled you from a river. But looking at Sana's face, at the relief and fragile hope he saw there, he understood that this was still more than she'd had before. This was survival. This was choice, even if the choices were limited and the freedom was conditional. This was life. Nalnish mounted his horse with the practiced ease of a man half his age, and the other 5 warriors prepared to depart. But before they turned to leave, the elder spoke one last time, his gaze fixed on Thorn with an intensity that demanded attention. Sana translated her voice soft. He say, "Treat her well, white man. She is no longer ours to protect or punish, but the spirits still watch. The ancestors still judge. Honor the sacred bond and you will be blessed. Break it and—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implied threat was clear enough. "I'll honor it," Thorn said, meeting the elder's eyes without flinching. "You have my word." Nalnish nodded once satisfied, then turned his horse and rode back toward the tree line. The 5 warriors followed, and within moments they disappeared into the forest as silently as they'd arrived, leaving nothing but hoofprints in the soft earth to prove they'd ever been there at all. For a long moment, Thorn and Sana stood in silence, processing what had just happened. The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the air, and somewhere nearby a bird was singing with aggressive cheerfulness, oblivious to the fact that 2 lives had just been fundamentally altered by ancient laws and desperate negotiations. Finally, Sana spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Torn, yeah, we are married now." Thorn turned to look at her. Really look at her. This woman who'd nearly drowned, who'd survived abandonment and punishment, who'd chosen to trust him, to stay with him, to build something with him. This woman who was now apparently his wife, according to laws he didn't understand, but had agreed to honor anyway. "I guess we are," he said, "though I'd have preferred to ask you properly. Maybe buy you a ring, have a ceremony with people who actually wished us well." Sana's lips quirked into a small smile, the fear finally beginning to drain from her expression. "Apache ceremony, very simple. Words and witness already have that." She paused, then added, "Ring is nice, but not necessary. White man tradition, not Apache tradition." "What about what you want?" Thorn asked. "Not Apache tradition, not white tradition. What does Sana want?" She considered this seriously, as she seemed to consider everything. Then she stepped closer, taking his hand in both of hers, a gesture that was becoming theirs, a physical manifestation of choice and connection. "Sana want what we had yesterday," she said quietly. "Before riders come, before sacred law, want to wake up in Torn's home, make coffee, work together, laugh together, sleep together, want to be partners, want to be—" She searched for the word, finally settling on equal. "Want to be equal even if law say different." Thorn's throat tightened with emotion he wasn't prepared for. He'd been married before to Margaret, and it had been good. She'd been his partner, his companion, his friend. But they'd come together in conventional ways, following conventional paths, building a conventional life. This was different. This was building something from desperation and necessity and the raw materials of survival. This was choosing connection in the face of death, choosing partnership over isolation, choosing each other when the world had given them every reason to choose nothing at all. "We're equal," Thorn said firmly. "I don't care what the sacred law says about responsibility and protection. Between you and me, we're equal. Partners. You have just as much say in this marriage as I do." He almost choked on the word marriage, but pushed through. "We'll figure out what that looks like as we go, but you get a voice, always. That's non-negotiable." Sana's smile widened, genuine warmth breaking through the tension of the morning. "Non-negotiable," she repeated, testing the word. Torn teach Sana big words now. Despite everything, the stress, the fear, the enormity of what had just transpired, Thorn found himself laughing. "Yeah, well, if we're going to be married, might as well expand your vocabulary. You're going to need all the big words you can get to keep up with my stubborn ass." "Already know stubborn," Sana said, her eyes dancing with amusement. "See stubborn every day." They stood there grinning at each other like fools, and Thorn realized that something had shifted. The weight of the sacred law, which had felt so oppressive just moments ago, was already transforming into something different, something that acknowledged what had already been growing between them, gave it a name and a framework, made it real in a way that transcended mere words or feelings. They'd been moving toward this anyway, he understood now. Last night had been the beginning. This morning was just confirmation, recognition. The universe or the spirits or whatever was out there beyond human understanding was simply acknowledging what Thorn and Sana had already been building together. "Come on," Thorn said, still holding her hand. "We've got a full day of work ahead. Just because we're married now doesn't mean the animals are going to feed themselves or the fences are going to mend themselves." "Married people work together," Sana agreed, falling into step beside him as they walked back toward the cabin. "Work, eat, sleep, live, same as before, just—" She paused, considering. "Just with words now, with name, with sacred law, saying what heart already knew." Thorn stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "What did your heart already know?" he asked quietly. Sana met his gaze without hesitation, without shyness. That Sana belong with Torn, not because of law, not because of rescue, because— She touched his chest again, that gesture over his heart that had become her signature move. "Because here is home, here is safe, here is—" She struggled with the English, frustrated, then said something in Apache that sounded like poetry. "What does that mean?" Thorn asked. "Mean the place where heart can rest, where soul is not afraid, where person can be whole." She smiled softly. "No good English word for this, but Torn understand, yes." "Yeah," Thorn said, his voice rough. "I understand, because he did. This cabin, this land, this life they were building, it had transformed from a place he survived into a place he lived. And the difference was her. Sana, with her quiet strength and her refusal to be helpless with her songs in Apache, and her careful English with her way of looking at him like he was worth something more than his past. They went inside together, and the cabin welcomed them back, like it had been holding its breath, waiting to see how the story would unfold. Thorn made coffee while Sana started breakfast, and they moved around each other with the practiced ease of people who'd been doing this dance for months rather than weeks. But something was different now. There was a lightness in the air, a sense of relief that came from having the unspoken finally spoken. They were married, by sacred law, by mutual choice, by whatever forces had conspired to pull Sana from that river and place her in Thorn's path. As they ate breakfast, Sana asked questions about white marriage customs, about what being married meant in Thorn's culture, about whether there were laws or expectations he hadn't mentioned. Thorn tried to explain as best he could, describing church weddings and legal documents and the social expectations that came with being someone's husband. But honestly, he admitted, I don't care much about any of that. The legal part, the social part, we can figure that out later if we need to. What matters is what's between us, how we treat each other, how we build this life. Apache way better, Sana said decisively. Simple, clear, sacred law say we married, so we married. No need for paper or church or— She made a gesture that suggested bureaucratic complication. No need for white man rules. Thorn had to agree. There was something refreshingly straightforward about the way it had happened. No months of courtship following rigid social protocols. No asking permission from family members who might disapprove. No worrying about whether she'd say yes or whether he was good enough or whether the timing was right. Just, you saved her life. You're responsible now. Accept the bond or reject it. Choose life or choose death. And they'd chosen life. The rest of the day passed in what would have been ordinary routine if not for the extraordinary shift in their status. They worked together, Thorn repairing sections of fence while Sana tended the small garden plot she'd started near the cabin, planting early spring vegetables with seeds she'd somehow saved from her old life. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable, punctuated by the sounds of labor and the occasional shared smile when their eyes met across the distance. By evening, when they came back inside and Sana started preparing dinner, Thorn found himself watching her with new eyes. His wife. The word felt strange in his mind, foreign and familiar at once. She was the same person she'd been yesterday, but the name had changed everything. Or maybe it had changed nothing, just acknowledged what was already true. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Sana pulled out her weaving project, the belt she'd been making for Thorn. She worked quietly, her fingers moving with practiced precision, and Thorn found himself mesmerized by the sight. "When will it be finished?" he asked. "Soon," Sana replied. "Maybe 2-3 days. Then Thorn have proper belt. Not—" She gestured at his current belt, which was indeed looking worse for wear. "Not falling apart belt." "You don't have to want to," Sana interrupted firmly. "Wife make things for husband. Husband provide for wife. This is balance. This is partnership." She looked up at him, making sure he understood. "Not obligation, choice. Sana choose to make belt. Thorn choose to accept gift. Equal. Equal." Thorn agreed, though he was starting to understand that equality didn't always mean identical roles. It meant mutual respect, mutual choice, mutual value. Sana would make him a belt because she wanted to, because it was her way of contributing, of showing care. And he would accept it with gratitude, not because he was owed her labor, but because accepting gifts was its own form of respect. That night, when they went to bed together, no longer tentative, no longer questioning, Thorn held Sana close and thought about how strange life was. A month ago, he'd been alone, surviving but not living, going through the motions of existence without any real purpose beyond making it to the next day. Now he was married, had a wife who'd been declared dead by her own people but was vibrantly alive in his arms, had a partner who challenged him, worked beside him, chose him despite having every reason to choose differently. Torn. Sana's voice came soft in the darkness. "Yeah, thank you for saying yes, for accepting sacred bond, for—" She shifted, turning to face him even though they could barely see each other in the dark. "For choosing Sana life over Sana death." Thorn pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over," he said. "And it's not just about saving your life, it's about—" He struggled for the words, finally settling on, "It's about choosing us, choosing this, whatever this becomes." "This becomes family," Sana said with quiet certainty. "Husband and wife, maybe someday more, children, home that is not just survival, but—" She used that Apache word again, the one that meant the place where hearts could rest. Children. The word hung in the air between them, carrying possibilities Thorn hadn't let himself consider. He wasn't a young man anymore. He'd thought that part of his life, the part with children and legacy and future, had died with Margaret. But maybe it hadn't. Maybe life was offering him a second chance, wrapped in unexpected package of a half-drowned Apache woman and ancient laws he didn't understand. "Maybe someday," Thorn agreed quietly, "if that's what we both want." "Want," Sana confirmed, "but not yet. First, just be husband and wife, learn each other, build strong foundation. Then," she paused and he could hear the smile in her voice, "then build family on strong foundation, Apache way." careful with respect, with proper time for each thing. Smart woman, Thorn murmured, already feeling sleep pulling at him. Smart enough to choose good man, Sana replied. Smart enough to say yes to sacred bond. Smart enough to know. She yawned, burrowing deeper into his embrace. To know when life gives gift, accept with grateful heart. They drifted off together, husband and wife, by sacred law partners, by choice survivors, by necessity, and something more, by the grace of whatever forces had conspired to bring them together. Outside, the canyon wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and the river, that same river that had nearly claimed Sana's life, ran on through the darkness, indifferent as always to the human dramas playing out on its banks. But inside the cabin, two people slept peacefully, bound by ancient laws and modern choices, building something new from the broken pieces of their pasts. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't look like just more survival. It looked like possibility. Spring arrived in earnest over the following weeks, transforming the canyon from winter's austere palette into something lush and green. The cottonwoods along the river exploded with new leaves, and wildflowers carpeted the meadows in waves of purple, yellow, and white. The land was waking up, stretching after a long sleep, and Thorn found himself waking up too, not from physical rest, but from the emotional hibernation he'd been living in since Margaret's death. Sana was the reason. She moved through his life, their life now, with a quiet purpose that transformed everything she touched. The garden she'd started had become her domain, and she worked it with the devotion of someone who understood that growing things was an act of faith. Every seed planted was a declaration, I will be here when this grows. I am building a future, not just surviving a present. Thorn watched her one morning as she knelt barefoot in the soil, her hair braided back, her hands dark with earth. She was humming one of her Apache songs, and the sound mixed with birdsong until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She'd made herself a proper dress now from fabric he'd bought on his last trip to town, a simple design, practical but with small decorative touches that were purely her own. She was reclaiming herself piece by piece, day by day. What are you planting? He called from where he stood, mending a harness. Sana looked up, squinting against the sun. Squash beans, corn, the three sisters. She patted the earth gently. Apache plant together, they help each other grow. Corn grows tall, gives beans something to climb. Beans put food in soil for corn and squash. Squash spreads big leaves, keeps weeds away, keeps ground wet. She smiled. Like family, each one helps the others. Thorn understood the metaphor. Smart planting, he said. Smart living, Sana corrected. She stood brushing dirt from her knees and walked over to where he worked. Thorn, I need to ask something. The seriousness in her tone made him set down the harness. What is it? When we go to town. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Her English had improved dramatically, but she still thought through complicated ideas before speaking. What we tell people about Sana, about us. Thorn had been dreading this conversation. They'd been living in a bubble out here, just the two of them, where the only law that mattered was the sacred bond they'd accepted. But the outside world, the white world, operated on different rules. Rules that didn't recognize Apache marriage customs. Rules that looked unkindly on white men living with Indian women, married or otherwise. The truth, Thorn said finally, you're my wife. But no paper, Sana pointed out. No. What word? Legal. Legal marriage, Thorn confirmed. No, we don't have that, but we could get it if you want. There's a circuit judge who comes through every few months. We could make it official in the eyes of white law, too. Sana considered this, her brow furrowed. Would change things. In some ways, yes. It would give you legal protection, rights. If something happened to me, you'd inherit this land, the cabin, everything. Without legal marriage, the law might try to take it away from you. And other ways, Sana asked. Ways that not good. Thorn sighed, appreciating her perceptiveness. Some people won't like it. won't like seeing an Indian woman married to a white man. They might say things, do things to make you feel unwelcome, to make us both feel unwelcome. Apache already say Sana dead, she replied with pragmatic calm. White people say bad things still better than being dead. Her logic was unassailable. Thorne found himself smiling despite the gravity of the conversation. All right then, next time the judge comes through, we'll make it legal. Get the paper. Make you Sana-matics in the eyes of white law, not just sacred law. Sana-matics, she repeated, testing the name. Sounds strange. You don't have to take my name if you don't want to, Thorne said quickly. That's a choice too. Sana shook her head. No is good. Sana had Apache name before. That name belongs to woman who is dead to Apache. This new name for new life, for woman who lives. She smiled. For wife. Something warm unfurled in Thorne's chest. The casual way she said wife now, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like they'd been married for years instead of weeks. That afternoon, they rode together into the small town of Mesilla, 15 miles east. Thorne needed supplies and had been putting off the trip partly because of the work that needed doing, and partly because he wasn't sure how to introduce Sana to his neighbors. But they couldn't hide forever, and practical necessity eventually trumped social anxiety. Sana rode behind him on Sergeant, her arms wrapped around his waist, and Thorne was intensely aware of her presence, the warmth of her body against his back, the way she leaned with him when they navigated rough terrain, the trust implicit in how she held on. When they reached Mesilla, a dusty collection of adobe buildings and false front stores, clustered around a central plaza, Thorne felt Sana tense behind him. She'd been to white settlements before he knew, but probably not in a context where she had to interact as an equal, rather than as someone passing through or trading. They dismounted in front of the general store, and immediately Thorne felt eyes turning their way. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, stopped mid-conversation with another woman to stare. 3 men sitting outside the saloon went quiet, their eyes tracking Sana's every movement. Thorne offered Sana his arm, and she took it after a moment's hesitation. They walked into the store together, and the bell over the door announced their entrance with cheerful ignorance of the tension in the air. Samuel Reed, who ran the store, looked up from his ledger, and his expression cycled through surprise, curiosity, and finally settled on cautious neutrality. "Thorne," he greeted, "haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy with spring work," Thorne replied evenly. "Sam, I'd like you to meet my wife, Sana." The word wife landed in the store like a stone in still water, and Thorne watched the ripples spread. Sam's eyes widened fractionally, then he recovered his composure and nodded to Sana. "Ma'am," he said, the politeness sounding slightly strained. "Hello." Sana replied, her voice clear and steady, despite Thorne feeling the tension in her arm. They conducted their business with professional efficiency. Thorne ordered supplies, flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition, while Sana examined fabrics and threads with the careful attention of someone who knew how to make resources stretch. Sam filled the order without comment, but Thorne could see the questions behind his eyes, the judgments forming and reforming. As they were finishing up, the door opened and Sheriff Dixon walked in, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw Thorne. "Maddox heard you were still breathing out there in the canyon. Some folks were starting to wonder if you'd—" He stopped mid-sentence, noticing Sana. "Well now, and who's this?" "My wife," Thorne said. And this time the word came out easier, more natural. "Sana, this is Sheriff Dixon. He's one of the good ones." Dixon's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, but unlike Sam, he didn't try to hide his surprise. "Your wife. Well, I'll be damned. Begging your pardon, ma'am." He removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. "When did this happen?" "Few weeks back," Thorne said, deliberately vague about the details. "We're planning to make it legal when the circuit judge comes through." "Already legal by sacred law," Sana added quietly, and Thorne felt a flash of pride at her refusal to diminish the legitimacy of their Apache marriage. Dixon studied them both for a long moment, and Thorn could practically see him working through the implications, the social complications, the potential troubles this might cause. But when he spoke, his voice was genuinely warm. "Well, congratulations to you both. Any man lucky enough to convince a woman to put up with him deserves celebrating." He turned to Sana directly. "Welcome to Mrs. Maddox. I hope folks here treat you with the respect you deserve." The emphasis on the last word was subtle but unmistakable, a message to anyone listening that Dixon would not tolerate harassment of Thorn's wife, Indian or not. "Thank you," Sana said, inclining her head with a dignity that would have done Apache royalty proud. They finished their shopping and left, but not before Thorn caught whispered conversations starting behind them, saw curtains twitching in windows, felt the weight of attention and judgment following them down the dusty street. Once they were mounted and heading back toward the canyon, Sana spoke. That was not as bad as Sana thought. "Sheriff Dixon's a decent man," Thorn said, "but not everyone will be like him. Some people—" He trailed off, not wanting to frighten her, but needing her to understand the reality they'd be facing. "Some people think Apache are animals," Sana finished bluntly. "Think Indian women are only good for—" She made a crude gesture that suggested exactly what some men thought Indian women were good for. Thorn's jaw tightened. "Anyone who treats you that way will answer to me." "And to Sana," she added firmly. "Sana not helpless, not victim. Sana is wife, yes, but also woman who knows how to fight, how to survive, how to—" She paused, searching for words. "How to make people regret being cruel." Despite himself, Thorn laughed. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." "Too late," Sana said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Already on bad side once. When Thorn tried to carry all supplies himself, hurt knee be stubborn fool." "That was one time," Thorn protested. "One time too many," Sana countered. "Husband and wife work together. Share load. This is partnership, remember." "I remember," Thorn said, and he did. She'd made it clear in 100 small ways that she wouldn't be coddled or protected, beyond reason that she expected to pull her weight, that she'd married a partner, not a keeper. They rode home in comfortable silence, and when they arrived, Sana immediately set about putting away their purchases, while Thorn tended to Sergeant. The division of labor was natural now, each of them taking on tasks that suited their skills and preferences without needing to discuss or negotiate. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Thorn cutting vegetables while Sana seasoned the stew, she brought up something that had clearly been on her mind. "Torn Sana been thinking about garden. What about it? Is big, too big for just 2 people." She stirred the pot thoughtfully. "Could grow more, could trade in town, vegetables, herbs, maybe weaving, could help with money, with supplies." Thorn paused in his cutting. The idea hadn't occurred to him, but it made sense. Sana had a gift for growing things, for making the earth yield more than it should. And they could use the extra income, especially if they wanted to expand the herd or make improvements to the property. "You want to start a business?" he asked. "Want to contribute," Sana corrected. "Want to be partner, not just wife who cooks and cleans. Want to build something together." There it was again, that fierce independence, that refusal to be diminished or relegated to a supporting role. She wanted to be active, useful, valuable beyond her domestic labor. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Thorn said sincerely. "We could expand the garden plot, maybe build a greenhouse for year-round growing. You could sell at the market in town, maybe even supply the stores and restaurants." Sana's face lit up with an enthusiasm he'd rarely seen. "Yes, and Sana knows Apache medicines, healing plants. Could grow those too. White people sick just like Apache sick. Need medicine same way." They spent the rest of dinner planning, discussing logistics and possibilities, and Thorn realized this was what marriage was supposed to be, 2 people building something bigger than either could create alone. Not a man providing for a dependent woman, but two partners investing their different skills and knowledge into a shared enterprise. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Thorn had known. They expanded the garden, working side by side in the warm spring sun. Sana taught him about companion planting, about reading the land and understanding what it needed. He taught her about white trading customs, about negotiating prices and dealing with merchants. And slowly, carefully, Sana began showing him other things: Apache custom songs, stories. She taught him words in her language, correcting his terrible pronunciation with patient amusement. She showed him how to track animals by signs he'd never learned to read properly. She shared her mother's recipes, her grandmother's wisdom, the accumulated knowledge of generations of Apache women who'd survived in this harsh land through skill and intelligence. In return, Thorn shared his own history stories about the war, about his brother who died at Vicksburg, about Margaret and the life they'd built before fever took her. He taught Sana to read and write in English, and her quick mind absorbed the lessons with startling speed. They were weaving their lives together, creating something hybrid and new, neither Apache nor white, but their own unique pattern. One afternoon in late April, Thorn came back from checking the cattle to find Sana standing in the garden with her hand pressed against her stomach, an odd expression on her face. "You all right?" he called, concerned. Sana turned to look at him, and her expression was complex: surprise, wonder, a little fear, and something that looked like joy struggling to assert itself. "Sana think—" She paused, licked her lips nervously. "Sana think maybe, baby." The world seemed to stop rotating for a moment. Thorn stood frozen, the words processing slowly through his mind like cold molasses. Baby, a child, the possibility they'd discussed in abstract terms, but hadn't expected so soon. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Not sure, but—" Sana moved her hand in a circle over her stomach. "Body feels different, and monthly bleeding should come 2 weeks ago, not come." Thorn crossed the distance between them in several long strides, his knee protesting the speed. He stopped in front of her, searching her face for clues about how she felt about this development. "How do you feel?" he asked. "About the possibility, I mean." Sana met his eyes, and he saw the fear there, but also the hope. "Scared," she admitted, "but also happy, maybe." She took his hand and placed it over her stomach, covering it with her own. "This is family. Yes, this is what we talked about, just sooner than expected." Thorn felt something shift in his chest, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves. A baby, his child, their child. A future that wasn't just survival, but continuation, legacy proof that life could spring from death and abandonment. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Together, whatever comes, we'll face it together." "Together," Sana agreed, and then she smiled, one of those rare, brilliant smiles that transformed her entire face. Wife and husband, soon maybe mother and father. They stood there in the garden, their hands joined over her still flat stomach, and Thorn thought about how strange life was. 6 months ago, he'd been alone, going through the motions, surviving, but not living. Now he was married to a woman his own people might judge, expecting a child who would be part Apache and part white, living a life that didn't fit neatly into anyone's categories or expectations. And he'd never been happier. The confirmation came weeks later, and with it, a new dimension to their lives. Sana's body changed gradually, her stomach rounding, her breasts growing fuller. She tired more easily, but refused to slow down, insisting that pregnant women had been working since the beginning of time, and she wouldn't be the first to stop. Thorn hovered, trying to help without making her feel fragile, walking the fine line between protective and overbearing. It was Sana who finally sat him down one evening and laid down the law. "Sana is pregnant, not dying," she said firmly. Sana's mother had 7 children, worked until the day each one born. Sana will do same. Stop trying to carry everything, do everything. Let Sana be strong. "I know you're strong," Thorn protested. "I just want to make sure you're safe." Safe and useless are different things. Sana countered. Trust Sana to know her own limits. Trust Sana to ask for help when needed. Stop deciding what Sana can and cannot do. It was a fair criticism, and Thorn took it to heart. He backed off, let her work at her own pace, trusted her judgment, and he watched with amazement as she continued to thrive tending the garden, making preserves, weaving, preparing for the arrival of their child, with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything. They made the marriage legal when the circuit judge came through in June. It was a simple ceremony in the judge's makeshift office, with Sheriff Dixon and his wife as witnesses. The judge asked the standard questions, and Thorn and Sana gave the standard answers, and just like that, they were married in the eyes of white law as well as sacred law. Mrs. Dixon hugged Sana afterward, tears in her eyes. "You'll be a wonderful mother," she said warmly. "And if you need anything, advice, help, anything at all, you come find me. We women need to look out for each other." It was a small kindness, but it mattered. Sana was finding allies in unexpected places, building connections that transcended the racial and cultural divides that should have kept them apart. Summer arrived, hot and relentless. Sana's garden flourished beyond all reasonable expectations, and they began selling produce in town just as she'd proposed. Her remedies and medicines gained a following among the townspeople who were willing to look past her heritage to recognize her skill. Money wasn't abundant, but it was steady, and the ranch began to feel less like a survival operation and more like a genuine homestead. And through it all, Sana's belly grew rounder, more prominent, until there was no hiding the pregnancy. She moved with the careful grace of a woman carrying precious cargo, and Thorn found himself constantly amazed by the miracle of it, life creating life, their love made manifest in flesh and blood. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the canyon, Sana took Thorn's hand and placed it on her stomach. "Feel," she instructed. Thorn waited, and then he felt it aflutter like a butterfly trapped beneath skin, the baby moving. "That's—" He couldn't find words adequate to the moment. "That's our child," Sana finished softly. "Our future, our family." Thorn pulled her close as her pregnant belly would allow, and pressed a kiss to her temple. "I love you," he said the first time he'd spoken those words aloud, though he'd felt them for months. Sana stiffened slightly in surprise, then relaxed against him. "Sana loved Thorn too," she replied. "Since River, maybe. Since you give respect when others give only cruelty. Since you see Sana as person, not thing." She paused, then added in Apache, a phrase he'd learned meant something like, "You are the home of my heart." "And you are mine," Thorn responded in his clumsy Apache, making her laugh at his pronunciation. They sat together as darkness fell, two people who'd found each other through impossible circumstances, who'd built something real and lasting from the fragments of broken lives. The river that had nearly killed Sana ran on below them, indifferent as always, but they were no longer defined by what it had tried to take. They were defined by what they'd chosen to build, by the life they'd created together, by the future growing beneath Sana's heart. When their daughter was born in October during the first cold snap of autumn, she came into the world screaming her displeasure at the temperature. Thorn had ridden desperately for Mrs. Dixon when Sana's labor started, and the older woman had come immediately bringing supplies and calm competence. The birth was hard, all births were hard, but Sana was strong, and when it was over she held a tiny, perfect human being with a shock of dark hair and lungs like a cavalry bugle. "What will you name her?" Mrs. Dixon asked, cleaning the baby with gentle efficiency. Thorn looked at Sana, deferring to her. They'd discussed names but never settled on anything definite. "Ayana," Sana said softly, gazing at her daughter with wonder. "Mean eternal bloom in Apache, because she is new life from old death. She is hope growing from loss." "And her white name," Miss Dixon prompted gently. "Grace," Thorn said suddenly, the name coming to him fully formed. "Ayana Grace Maddox, because she is grace we don't deserve but received anyway. Sana looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, tears of exhaustion and joy and overwhelming love. Perfect, she whispered. She is perfect, and we are perfect, and this life is... She switched to Apache, unable to find English words big enough. This is the place where hearts rest. This is home. This is family. Thorn took his daughter in his arms for the first time, marveling at how something so small could feel so heavy with significance. Ayanna Grace Maddox, daughter of a Union soldier and an Apache woman born into a world that might judge her but would never break her if they raised her right. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Welcome to your family. Welcome to your home. Welcome to a life where you get to choose who you become." And looking at Sana, exhausted but radiant, holding their daughter between them, Thorn understood that this was what sacred law had really been about all along. Not ownership or obligation, but the recognition that some bonds transcend culture and law and logic, that sometimes saving a life means saving your own, that sometimes the best families are the ones you build from scratch, using respect and choice and love as your foundation. The river had tried to take Sana from the world, but instead it had delivered her to this threshold, to this cabin, to this man who saw her as human first and everything else second. And from that desperate beginning, they'd built something beautiful, a marriage of equals, a partnership of survivors, a family forged in the fires of loss and tempered by the choice to keep living, keep loving, keep believing that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. Outside, winter was coming again, bringing cold and hardship and all the challenges that frontier life demanded. But inside, wrapped in blankets and firelight and each other, Thorn and Sana and Ayanna Grace formed a circle of warmth that no winter could penetrate. They were a family now, not despite their differences, but because of them. Not in spite of the sacred law that had bound them, but because they'd chosen to honor it in the only way that mattered, with respect, with equality, with love freely given and gratefully received. They belonged to each other not by obligation or tradition, but by the most sacred law of all, the one written in choice, sealed in trust, and proven every single day in the ordinary miracles of shared life.